Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of our Odinism videos. We are going to be discussing and comparing the accounts of Baldr and Jesus, whether or not it was a copy or a counterfeit. When a claim is made that one text is copied from another, there's two extremely important questions you need to ask, as well as a very important rule to remember that will always be true when asking if something copied something from someone else. The questions are, which writing came first, and what exactly has been copied from the other. The rule is you can't copy something that doesn't exist yet. So the question, which writing came first, Baldr or Jesus? Well, the earliest source possible that mentions Baldr, especially in the context of a dead and rising god, goes back to the earliest written source Odinism has, the Eddas. This collection of poems were based on oral tradition passed through Norse culture for centuries. In fragmentary form, a Christian bishop uncovered the works of Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian convert himself, what later became known as the Codex Regius. Snorri's collection included 29 poems, only one of which for certain was complete, and dates to around the 14th century AD. Now note there are others that are claimed to have been complete only upon the discovery of later data. But there are claims, however, that Saemund the Wise in the 10th century AD was the original source that Snorri got the oral traditions from in writing form. But in those claims, according to Dr. Henry Adams Bellows, these are entirely speculative. So for the sake of this analysis, we're going to be as generous as possible for our Odinist friends and grant that these writings, especially our main source Voluspo, dates to the 10th century AD, even if it's just in fragments. The material, when discussing these issues, is always best to let the text speak plainly for itself. Baldr's death, resurrection, and return are taken from three main poems. The poem Voluspo, being the first of which, gives us a prophetic overlook from a giantess raised from the dead by Odin to tell him the story of the world as well as the fate of the gods, what's known as Ragnarok. In Voluspo, verses 32 through 33, Volva says, I saw for Baldr, the bleeding god, the son of Odin, his destiny set, famous and fair in the lofty fields. Full grown in strength, the mistletoe stood. From the branch which seemed so slender and fair came a harmful shaft that Hoth should hurl. But the brother of Baldr was born ere long, and one night old, thought Odin's son. His hands he washed not, his hair he combed not, till he bore to the bale blaze Baldr's foe. But in Fensalir did Frigg weep sore for Valhall's need. Would you know yet more? Likewise, later on in verse 59 all the way to 62, now do I see the earth anew rise all green from the waves again. The cataracts fall, and the eagle flies, the fish he catches beneath the cliffs. The gods in Ethavol meet together. Of the terrible girder of earth they talk, and the mighty past they call to mind, and the ancient runes of the ruler of the gods. In wondrous beauty once again shall the golden table stand mid the grass, which the gods had owned in the days of old. Then fields unsowed bear ripened fruit, all ills grow better, and Baldr comes back. Baldr and Hoth dwell in Hrop's battle hall, and the mighty gods, would you know yet more? Now from Voluspo, what do we learn about Baldr? Well, he was killed by a mistletoe dart thrown by Hoth, who was blind, by the way. And when the world is remade after Ragnarok, Baldr and Hoth will return together. So, with that first source clarified, we'll move on to our second. The poem Lokasenna is a record of Loki's drunken rants against the Aesir, where he points out all of their dirty little secrets, including but not limited to taking full responsibility for Baldr's death. Lokasenna, verses 27 through 28. But if a son like Baldr were by me now, here within Aesir's hall, from the sons of the gods thou shouldst not go forth till thy fierceness in fight were tried, Loki spake. Wilt then, Frigg, What further I tell of the ill that I know? Mine is the blame that Baldr no more thou seest ride home to the hall. So from Locusenna, we learn an additional detail that Loki learned Baldr's one weakness and gave Hoth the dart. The poem of Baldr's Drummer is our third and final source, which, by the way, isn't in the Codex Regius, but nonetheless will be included. Details another conversation Odin had, like in Voluspo, but with Baldr more as the focus and his dreams that he's been having over his imminent death. In verses 8 through 10 we read, Wise woman, cease not, I seek from thee all to know, that I fain would ask, shall the bane of Baldr come, and steal the life from Odin's son? Thou hither bears the far-famed branch, he shall the bane of Baldr become, and steal the life from Odin's son. Unwillingly I spake, and now I would be still. Wise woman, cease not, I seek from thee all to know, that I fain would ask, who shall vengeance win for the evil work, or bring to the flames the slayer of Baldr? Rind bears Vali in Vestralir, and the one knight of old fights Odin's son. His hands shall he wash not, his hair shall he comb not, till the slayer of Baldr he brings to the flames. Unwilling I spake, and now I would be still. So she's being forced to say these things. From Baldr's Drummer, we see repeated no additional details apart from Baldr's death, the one responsible for it, or the means by which it happened, and the one additional detail notes of him being cremated afterwards. We can also learn this detail in Vathruthnismol, verses 54 through 55, even though Baldr isn't specifically named. So in conclusion, along with the insight of the younger Eddas, with the commentary of translators and scholars, the death and resurrection of Baldr is as follows. Baldr, the biological offspring of Odin, was immune to all harm due to the enchantments of Frigg. All the elements of nature would not harm him except for the mistletoe. When Loki, another separate deity from Odin and Baldr, discovered this, he gave another deity that was blind, named Hoth, a mistletoe arrow that accidentally killed Baldr. He was then cremated and won't return until after the world is made new following Ragnarok. Now let's compare this to the data and dates of Jesus, his death and resurrection. The earliest possible mention of Jesus, especially referring to his death and resurrection, obviously is going to go back to the earliest written evidence of the New Testament's existence. A fragment of the Gospel according to John, which was written as an eyewitness biography of Jesus' life from the Apostle John himself, was discovered in John Ryland's library and was dated to the later 90s AD, since the original writing of John would have been dated, according to early church fathers like Polycarp, to the reign of Emperor Domitian, who reigned from 70 to 96 AD. We're talking about a piece of a copy written within a decade of the original. And generally, you can't find pieces of something that doesn't exist yet. So, if the Gospel of John was dated to 96 at the latest, it is within 60 years of the original historical event. And there's nothing that close to the original event that has been discovered in ancient history anywhere, religious or otherwise. We do have written copies of Gospels that historically would have been earlier than John, but for the sake of being generous to our Odinist friends, we're only going to allow what we actually have writing of. The Gospel of John dates to the very end of the 1st century, where the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are all recorded. And note that if you want to raise the objection that John Ryland's fragment, P52, only includes a few verses from John, chapter 18, 31 through 33 on one side, and 37 through 38 on the other, remember that the earliest discovery of Snorri Sturluson's manuscripts only included a handful of complete poems, and weren't completed until later, and the majority of which are still missing portions today. Voluspo and Locusenna are two such examples. Baldr's drama is entirely absent from the original Eddas until 2 to 3 centuries later. So if we're only going to allow what we have fragments for, the data about Baldr jumps ahead another 2 to 3 centuries along with Christianity. So if you're wanting to say that Baldr's resurrection story was earlier than Jesus's, you have to be as early as you can get. I would not advise this standard. So now for the material. According to the New Testament scholars, both atheist and agnostic. I'm not going to mention a single Christian here. We were given the earliest possible information about what people believed about Jesus within months of his historical death, after having given Odinism 3 sections of their scriptures. To detail for us Baldr's death, I'm only going to use 2 verses. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4. For I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. By the way, all this can be confirmed through the Gospel of John alone. But to properly appreciate this little piece of literature, this verse didn't come into existence historically, remember, when Paul wrote them. Atheist scholars who didn't even believe these claims are true still acknowledge that they were believed and shared by early Christians in the form of creeds, short little verse stanzas that even illiterate audiences could sing together to memorize. According to James D.G. Dunn from the infamous Jesus Seminar, referring to 1 Corinthians 3-7, says this tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death. Michael Goulder from the Jesus Seminar says Paul received this tradition, that is, he was taught it, at his conversion, perhaps 2 years after Jesus' death. Ulrich Wilkins says the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Gerard Ludemann says the elements within the tradition are to be dated within the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul Barnett says 2 or 3 years within the first Easter. Richard Burge and Graham Gould say from only a few years after Jesus' death. Robert Funk says within 2 or 3 years at most. And note that these non-Christian scholars all acknowledge Jesus as a historical figure, since a historical death requires a historical birth. So in conclusion, according to the earliest possible sources in all of ancient history referring to anything, we have it in writing and believed by the earliest followers of Christianity on record that Jesus died, confirmed by John 19, 28-30, for the purpose of redeeming us for our sins, according to John 3:16-17, was buried in the publicly accessible tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, John 19:38-42, as he predicted, John 12:20-36. He rose from the dead, John 20:19, to prove that he was the one and only God of Israel, John 8:58. And remember, I'm only allowing myself the Gospel of John since it's the earliest written source that we have physical evidence for. So to answer the question this entire study is based on, is Jesus a copy or a counterfeit of Baldr? Well, given the earliest written evidence of Baldr's death and resurrection is the 10th century AD, after bending over backwards to make sure we give every single allowance for Odinism, based on the evidence, the earliest written evidence of Jesus' death and resurrection is the 1st century AD. And after making incredible sacrifices and discarding 95% of all the evidence we could have to support this claim, once again, what is rule number 1 in copying? You can't copy something that doesn't exist yet. So the question, did Christians copy something that didn't exist until 1,000 years after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection was put into writing? No. If you are looking for a religion based on history, I cannot recommend Odinism. If you are looking for a God worth following, I recommend Jesus Christ. We'll see you next time. God bless you.